Singer Bowl, August 1968. 15,000 people packed into the New York Stadium thought they knew what a rock concert should look like. They had seen the Beatles. They had watched the Rolling Stones. But when a young fan rushed the stage during the haunting finale of The End. That night, Jim Morrison did something that would shatter performance safety rules forever. The moment that fans' feet touched the stage, Morrison made a split-second decision, one that still echoes in every concert venue today. Security froze. The band stopped playing. And Morrison did something no rock star had ever attempted before. If you're curious about these unknown moments in rock music history, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Now let's go back to that night. Morrison stepped away from the microphone, walked to the edge of the stage, spread his arms wide, and threw his head back. As the spotlights illuminated him, his shadow loomed large on the stadium wall. Sweat dripped from his leather pants. He had already taken off his black leather jacket, and his bare chest glistened in the humid air of a Long Island summer night. Ray Manzarek's Vox Continental organ created a hypnotic wave. Robbie Krieger's guitar filled the air with feedback screams, and John Densmore's drums kept a tribal rhythm. The End. This 11-minute song showcased Morrison's darkest theatrical performance, and now they were approaching the finale. This is the end, my only friend, the end. Morrison repeated the words, his voice rising slightly with each repetition. 15,000 people held their breath, watching Morrison's every word, every movement. Security guards stood at the edge of the stage, but their attention was not on them. It was focused on that shamanistic figure on stage. Even the young people in the back rows of the stadium were standing, craning their necks to see Morrison. At that very moment, a young man in the front rows climbed over the barrier. He was a 20-year-old fan with long hair and jeans, determined to reach Morrison. His hands climbed over the barrier, his feet left the ground, and he cleared the metal obstacle. The security guard noticed immediately. He was a large, short-haired man, in uniform, with quick reflexes. He began pushing through the crowd, baton in hand, shouting, but his voice was lost in the music. The young fan had started climbing onto the stage. His hands grabbed the edge of the stage. He pulled his knees up, and within seconds, he was only a few feet away from Morrison. Drenched in sweat, his heart pounding in his chest, his eyes locked on Morrison. He had no plan. Something inside him had just pushed him there. Distance, barriers, rules. They all vanished in that moment. The security guard was climbing the stage, his hands reaching for the young man's wrists. He raised his baton. 15,000 people tried to understand what was happening, when suddenly the music stopped. Ray Manzarek took his fingers off the keys. Robbie Krieger stopped playing his guitar. John Densmore held his drumsticks in the air. The stage suddenly fell silent, and the only sounds were the security guard's footsteps and the young fan's rapid breathing. Morrison turned. His eyes locked onto the young man. The security guard was about to step onto the stage, baton raised, preparing to throw the young man off. 15,000 hearts had stopped. They waited. Would it be fear? Violence? Chaos? Not a word came from Morrison's mouth, but his body began to move. He raised his hand. He signaled the security guard to stop. It was a clear, unambiguous gesture. His palm faced the guard, his fingers extended. Stop. Morrison's lips moved, but no sound came out. The security guard froze. His baton remained in the air. His feet were nailed to the ground. He was confused because the protocol was clear. Remove anyone who came on stage. Protect the artist. Use force. But Morrison was telling him to stop. Morrison turned to the young man and smiled. It was a genuine, sincere smile. There was no threat in his eyes, no fear, no anger. Only recognition. Not the recognition of a fan, the recognition of a human being, the recognition of a brother. And he extended his hand. The young man was stunned. The security guard was stunned. The crowd was stunned. 15,000 people were stunned. Morrison held his hand there in a waiting, inviting gesture. Seconds passed, but no one moved. The stadium was silent. You could even hear the sounds of insects on a summer night. Then the young man approached hesitantly, step by step, slowly, still in disbelief. Morrison took his hand. It was a warm handshake, strong, real. Then he pulled him close, touched his shoulder, and turned to the microphone. The young man stood next to Morrison, his legs trembling, unable to breathe. Morrison looked at him and whispered. Only that young man could hear, but he later recounted in an interview. "Are you ready to sing with me, brother?" Morrison had called him brother. Morrison turned to the band and nodded. Ray Manzarek touched the keys again, slowly, carefully, at a tempo they had never played before. Robbie Krieger strummed the guitar strings, softly, almost like a whisper. John Densmore gave the drums a light rhythm. They were starting the finale of the end, again. But this time it was different. This time there were two vocals on stage. Morrison and the young fan stood side by side. Morrison held the microphone between them and began to sing. "This is the end, beautiful friend." The voice was Morrison's deep baritone, familiar, powerful, hypnotic. But then a second voice joined in, the young fan's voice. It trembled. The notes weren't quite right. There was no breath control, but it didn't matter. Morrison looked at him, encouraged him, smiled. The young man sang a little louder. Morrison moved the microphone a little closer to him. They sang together. The end. 15,000 people witnessed this scene. Rock star and a fan, under the stage lights, equal, brothers, together. The crowd erupted. Screams, applause, cheers shook the stadium walls. Morrison hugged the young man. It was a real hug, not fake, not for show. He patted him on the back. Then he turned to the crowd and pointed at his fan. "This is your brother," Morrison shouted. "This is all of you." The crowd surged even higher. People were crying. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Some had jumped to their feet, arms raised. The security guard was still on stage, but now didn't know what to do. Morrison turned to him, shook his head, a sign of thanks, but also a dismissal. The guard slowly backed away, lowered his baton, and left the stage. The young fan was still standing next to Morrison, in shock, unable to believe it was real. Morrison looked at him once more, squeezed his shoulder, and led him to the edge of the stage. He directed the fan toward the crowd, under the spotlights, where everyone could see. Then he turned to the band, and they started the next song. The concert continued, but nothing was the same anymore. Something in the crowd had changed. The invisible wall between the stage and the audience had cracked. Morrison hadn't just brought a fan on stage. He had elevated that fan to an equal level. He had shared the microphone with him. He had given him a platform. And in doing so, he had questioned the fundamental dynamic of rock music. Was the wall between the stage and the audience really necessary? Backstage, the debate began when the concert ended. The security chief was furious. He yelled at Morrison, his face bright red, veins bulging. He said he had violated protocols, increased the risk, hadn't thought about what could happen. What if that young man had been carrying a gun? What if he had used violence? What if the other 15,000 people had tried to get on stage too? Chaos could have ensued. There could have been injuries. There could have been deaths. Morrison just listened. As he put on his leather jacket, he took a sip from the whiskey bottle. His eyes were tired but calm. He replied, his words simple but profound. He wasn't a threat. He was family. The security chief shook his head, unable to believe it, found nothing else to say, and walked out the door. Ray Manzarek, Robbie Krieger, and John Densmore sat silently backstage. Manzarek spoke first. "Jim, that was a risky move." Morrison turned, his eyes locked on Manzarek. "Everything we do is risky, Ray. But that was real. It was real. That moment was real. The performances on stage, the costumes, the lights, the shows, it was all a construct. But the moment he shared with that young fan wasn't artificial. Two people, a microphone, a song. For Morrison, that was what music should be. Not hierarchy, not distance, not barriers. Sharing, community, ritual. 3 weeks later, another concert in Chicago. When the Doors took the stage, the security team was twice as large as usual. Word of the Singer Bowl incident had spread, and the organizers feared a repeat. Barriers were reinforced. Security guards were stationed frequently at the edge of the stage. Emergency protocols were reviewed. Morrison came on stage and saw the crowd. 12,000 people. When they started playing Light My Fire, Morrison stopped in the middle of the song. He signaled to the band, and the music slowed down. Morrison took the microphone and spoke to the crowd. "Tonight, we're not just performing for you. We're performing with you." The crowd screamed. Morrison pointed to a fan in the front rows, a young woman. "You, come up here." Security panicked, but Morrison stopped them. The young woman came on stage, trembling, and approached Morrison. Morrison handed her the microphone. "Sing with me." And they sang together. After Chicago came Detroit. After Detroit came Cleveland. At every concert, Morrison invited at least one fan on stage. Sometimes one person, sometimes two, once three. It wasn't controlled. It wasn't organized. It was spontaneous. But there was never any violence, because Morrison chose those moments carefully. He looked at the crowd, scanning with his eyes, searching for a connection. When he found that connection, he invited them. The Doors manager was worried. This behavior was increasing insurance costs, scaring organizers, and some venues were considering canceling concerts. But Morrison wouldn't listen. "This is what music should be," he said. "We're not gods on stage. We're humans, like them." Ray Manzarek later described this period in an interview. "By bringing those fans on stage, Jim was trying to prove something. That music wasn't elitist, distant, or unattainable. The stage didn't belong only to us. At that moment, it belonged to everyone." Manzarek's words perfectly summed up Morrison's philosophy. While studying film at UCLA, Morrison had researched performance art and ritual theories. He was influenced by Antonin Artaud's concept of the theater of cruelty. Artaud argued that theater should transform the audience from passive observers into active participants. Morrison adapted this idea to rock music. By 1969, Morrison's stage style was causing controversy in the rock industry. Some critics found it revolutionary. Rolling Stone magazine published an article, "Jim Morrison, Performing a Revolution." The article described Morrison's behavior of inviting fans on stage as a democratic act. It argued that music was moving away from being an elite activity and becoming a collective experience. But on the other hand, industry leaders were concerned. Concert organizers, venue owners, security companies, all found Morrison's behavior risky. If an artist invited fans on stage, control could be lost. Injuries could occur. Lawsuits could be filed. Insurance companies were raising premiums, and some venues were blacklisting the Doors. And then came Altamont. In December 1969, at a free Rolling Stones concert, the Hells Angels were used as security, and a fan, Meredith Hunter, was stabbed to death. This incident shook the rock industry. Security protocols were debated, tightened, and standards raised. And what Morrison did, inviting fans on stage, became even more controversial. But Morrison didn't stop. Even after the Miami scandal, even under the threat of conviction, he continued to invite fans on stage. Because for him, it wasn't a performance tactic. It was a philosophy, a belief. Music should bring people together, not divide them. When Morrison died in Paris in 1971, he was 27 years old. He left behind songs, poems, and a legacy. The Singer Bowl incident was a small but meaningful part of that legacy, because the movement Morrison started didn't die with him. Other artists noticed and carried it on. Bruce Springsteen began inviting fans on stage at concerts in the late 1970s. He would pick someone from the crowd, sing with them, hand them his guitar, and share the experience. Springsteen said in an interview, "Jim Morrison was the first to do this. He showed us that the stage is not a castle, but a bridge." Pearl Jam continued this in the 1990s. Eddie Vedder frequently invited fans on stage, performed with them, and shared the microphone. Green Day took it even further in the 2000s. Billy Joe Armstrong would sometimes bring a fan on stage and have them sing an entire song, guitar included. Foo Fighters, The Killers, Coldplay, they all carried on this tradition, bringing a fan on stage, making them feel like a star for a moment, breaking down barriers. And each time, that moment at the Singer Bowl in 1968 echoed. Morrison's bold move that night was etched into the DNA of modern rock concerts. But along with that, security protocols evolved. After Morrison's spontaneous gesture, the industry realized that if artists were going to invite fans on stage, it had to be controlled. Planned interactions were preferable to random stage invasions. Today, at large concerts, security teams talk to the artists beforehand. If they plan to invite fans on stage, it is organized. Which section will be selected, how they will get on stage, how long they will stay, how security will intervene. Everything is planned. Morrison's spontaneous gesture became a system, but the essence of that night is still preserved, breaking down the wall between the stage and the audience, seeing fans not just as consumers, but as part of the experience, experiencing music not as a hierarchy, but as a community. By 1970, Morrison's behavior had become even more unpredictable. His alcohol addiction was worsening, he had gained weight, and his stage performances were inconsistent. Sometimes he was magnificent, sometimes disastrous. But the tradition of bringing fans on stage continued. Some concerts even turned into almost spontaneous jam sessions. Morrison would sometimes stop the song midway to read poetry. Sometimes bring 3 or 4 people from the crowd on stage and improvise with them. The Doors' last concert took place in New Orleans in December 1970. It was a small venue called The Warehouse, with a capacity of only 3,000 people. Morrison looked tired on stage, bearded, overweight, his eyes distant. But during the concert, he invited 5 different fans on stage. He talked with them, sang songs, recited poetry. At the end of the concert, Morrison turned to the crowd and said his final words. "Are you having a good time?" The crowd screamed. Morrison smiled. "Good, because this is what it's all about. Not me. You." 6 months later, Morrison died in Paris. He was 27 years old. He was buried in Père Lachaise Cemetery, and his grave is still a pilgrimage site visited by fans from all over the world. But Morrison's real legacy lives on, not in that grave, but in his stage performances. Today, concert security is much more complex. Metal detectors, professional security teams, strict protocols, camera systems, emergency plans. A fan getting on stage is now a completely controlled process. But that magical moment still happens. An artist looks out at the crowd, picks someone, invites them up. That person gets on stage, grabs the mic, sings a song, and that moment reaches back to the Singer Bowl in 1968. What Morrison did that night was more than just a gesture. He redefined the spirit of rock music. He showed that music wasn't a hierarchy, but a community. He proved that the stage wasn't a fortress, but a bridge. And most importantly, he reminded us that fans weren't just spectators, but part of the experience. Every fan who takes the stage, every shared microphone, every broken wall traces back to that night. The Lizard King didn't just break the rules, he completely redefined them. And today, even 50 years later, that moment at Singer Bowl still beats at the heart of rock concerts. Morrison once said, "I'm interested in anything about revolt, disorder, chaos, especially activity that appears to have no meaning." But what he did at Singer Bowl wasn't chaotic. It wasn't meaningless. On the contrary, it revealed the deepest meaning of rock music. Music brings people together. It breaks down barriers. It makes us all equal. And that night, Morrison demonstrated this perfectly.